MBTA General Manager Phillip and transportation officials giving an update on the track defects on the Green Line, and let's listen in.
Both Union and Medford Tufts branches on October the 10th. However, taking a deeper dive into the project, it was important to find out why we had these conditions existing on a project that was recently opened. And taking a look into the project records, we were able to identify that the first instance of tight gauge that was observed on the project was back on April 2021, when GLX constructors inspectors identified in a yard tight gauge that existed as a result of ties and pre-installed tie plates that were in the yard area. Now, those conditions were addressed. I believe that at that time, it was the appropriate time and should have been when the project team and design builders took a look at how we had those conditions exist. And anyway, in November of 2022, prior to opening of the Medford Tufts line, another geometry track scan was done by the MBTA. At that time, it identified 29 locations that had gauge that was less than 56 1/8 inch, and when it's less than 56 1/8, it means it has to be addressed in terms of a repair to bring it back within the appropriate measurements. Those 29 locations were addressed prior to opening, and that was confirmed. That run in November in terms of the geometry track scan also identified significant portions of both Union and Medford Tufts that had tight gauge but not restrictable gauge, meaning you could run trains safely, our employees could operate trains safely, and our riders can ride safely. I also believe at that time it was an opportunity to still address those conditions prior to opening service. However, it's also possible to address them later, which the project decided to do as part of a project closeout. And that's what led to us continuing to have restrictable conditions in future geometry track scans. What I've done since that point is I have had a meeting with GLX constructors last week, where we instructed them to come back to the agency with their review of the situation, with a proposal to address the larger scale need to bring the track gauge back into what the project requirements were. Those are design standards within this construction tolerances, which are plus or minus 1/8 of an inch. I am pleased to say that that meeting, they were in the same alignment with us that it was important to address these conditions once and for all. They have provided a proposal to us, which we're reviewing, both scope, implementation, and we've not gone back to them yet, but we are reviewing that right now, which we will be sitting down with them shortly. The goal is to make sure, now that we're aware of this situation, that they're addressed timely, addressed properly, so these situations not continue to repeat. So I think just to put a little bit of context to it, the last geometry track scan runs indicate that 50% of the Union branch requires regaging, and 80% plus or minus requires regaging on Medford Tufts. Again, that does not mean that the trains are running today unsafely. It means that we're going to have the GLX constructors regauge the track to bring it back to what the project called for. And once we have a plan in place, we'll share that with the public. And the goal is to make sure that we do that in the least impactful way, most efficient way, and put this behind us. I think with that, I will take some questions. And
can you explain what regauge means to the public? What needs to be done to these tracks?
Yes, so the project had the design standard between the two running rails of the track. 56 1/2 inch is the design standard. The measurements that we're seeing are less than 56.5. They're less than 56 and 7/16, which would have been within the construction tolerance. And what we're seeing is a significant portion, 50% on Union, 80% plus or minus on Medford Tufts, falls below those figures. By regaging, it means, and there's different ways of doing it, what we did in the most recent defects was to remove the spikes that hold the tie plates in place, fill those holes, shift the plates over to the appropriate width, and then re-drill and then re-spike. And that means for the whole length of the project that requires the regaging of the tracks, that means bringing it back to the appropriate width between the running rails.
So why did this happen in the first place?
So the early indication, and while we're still reviewing the actual cause, but the amount of the track that requires regaging leads me to believe this is tied to the fabrication of the ties and the pre-installed plates. And that's why I believe we have such significant lengths that need to be regauged.
So you don't think it was an error made by the people who were putting it in there? Or is, I'm just trying to get a sense of what you're saying.
The plates, from all the records I have on the ties, were pre-installed, which is likely why we are seeing such significant lengths that need to be regauged.
Say that again, I didn't quite understand that.
The wood ties that are underneath the tracks, the tie plates that are anchored to those ties were pre-installed prior to being brought to the project site. So that's where I believe is the likely cause of this. Still being reviewed, but those tie plates are meant to hold the rails in place so there's no movement. So I know there's been a lot of discussion with regards to narrowing. Most likely it's tied to the assembly of the ties and the tie plates.
And where was that pre-installation done?
That was off-site.
Like at a company, or?
Yes, that was part of the material suppliers by the design-build constructors.
When it's fixed, will it go back to 56.5 inches? I mean, will it be at 56.5 inches?
The project requires 56.5 plus or minus a 16th. The project does allow the design-build team to request an exemption. They've not requested one as of yet. We have told them if they wish to, they should submit that as part of this proposal. But it will be brought back into industry standards.
If they're not 56.5 inches now, what are they? I missed that.
I think what we're seeing is that a significant portion of the measurements are falling between 56 and 1/8 and 56 and 3/8.
When did anyone at the chief first learn that these were not properly gauged, and how long did you know about it before today?
I found out about it recently after looking into this in more detail. The early indication, as I mentioned, that there was tight gauge in this yard facility that was back in April of 2021. And we also had other reports in November of 22 that indicated the widespread need to address more than just these isolated conditions. Back in April of 2021, is my belief that it could have been and should have been more proactively investigated prior to opening and prior to installing what we've done.
So how does this get paid for then, this regaging process here? Is that, I mean, the same company and supplier gets to remake the original faulty ties and plates? Or how does this get paid for?
What we've directed the GLXC, the constructors, to do is to come back to us with a proposal. This is not something that the public should be paying for, it's not going to pay for. We're reviewing the root cause still. What I've given you is my thought process on where I see some of the challenges. All of that will be taken care of as part of the closeout, but the project needs to follow the project requirements, and that means delivering us track that meets the design standards within the construction tolerances.
How
Do you
can
still
the
have
trains
faith?
continue to run right now, knowing that this is the situation?
Because when the tracks are in maintenance standards, it doesn't mean it's unsafe to run trains. It means that it's something that we want to continue to inspect, which we do. We have track walkers 3 times a week. We have track geometry cars 4 times a year. But it also means if it gets to the lower end of 56 1/8, is you should be taking some remedial measures. And that's why we've directed GLXC last week to give us those proposals so we could tackle this and bring it back to the higher end within the project requirements.
I think the average person just wants to know what kind of an inconvenience this is going to be for them. Can you share that? Do you know that right now?
What I can tell them, it's not going to be years, it's not going to be months. The proposal that we have is weeks, and it's something that we're still reviewing, because as I've mentioned, whether it's this type of repair or others, you know, how do we do it in minimizing the impacts to our riders, whether it's overnights, whether it's some early access weekends. We understand the importance of this system, including the extension to the riders. And we will make sure that when we have a proposal that we're talking publicly about this as well.
Can I just ask you, you know, you just got here this year. This is a $2.3 billion project that they cut the ribbon on in 2022. Is this frustrating for you?
Well, I think what's frustrating is the fact that these are things that all projects have challenges and issues that arise. I think it's how you tackle those issues. And what I believe is that when you take on these roles and the responsibilities of these roles, you have an accountability to not only the project, you have an accountability to the public. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's an opportunity that should have been where we were more proactive, identify the problem, identify the solution, and then take the action. And that's what we're doing now, that we know it's a much wider spread concern. Again, it's not a safety concern, but I'm not going to leave it where it continues to linger.
Okay, one last question,
Do you
please.
still have faith in GLX
If they knew
instructors,
this in
given that they
April.
couldn't do this right the first time around? Do you think that they're appropriately equipped to fix the problem that they created in the first place?
The fix is not that difficult. I have faith that they can accomplish that fix.
If you knew this, they knew this in April and you just found out, that must be frustrating.
That is something that we are looking to change the culture within our agency. We're looking to change the culture across the board. Once you identify a problem, it should be brought to everyone's attention. Even if you have a solution, it's good to know, because the sooner you know, the more chance you have to address it before it becomes a much more challenging thing. To fix it as part of the punch list, per se, is more challenging because of the impact to the public. If you knew in April of 2021 and you could have proactively avoided this, I think that it's in everyone's best interest that it had been done, because you don't want to install something and then only later have to fix it. So.
Thank you.
Do you think your predecessors kept this quiet for political reasons, trying to wrap it up in Governor Baker's final year in office?
I don't have any indication of that. All I know is that I believe the team could have been more proactive and should have been more proactive.
Okay, thank you.